We are live. We are just about at the top of the hour, so we're gonna wait a few minutes, let some folks who might be joining a few minutes late have some time to join. So just bear with us. In the meantime, if you are joining us now, thanks for being here. And one thing I always like to do is have folks put in the comments where they're joining from. So it's very interesting to see where around the world folks are watching our live stream. So just put your location in the LinkedIn comments. Also, if you have any questions, comments, concerns at the outset, feel free to put them in the comments as well, and we can try to address those before we get going. But once again, just give us a minute or two, and then we'll get going here. All right, someone from Cyprus. Very cool. Neat. Where else? Where's everybody else from? Feel free to put it in the comments, and we'll get kicking off in just a minute or two here. All right, looks like we've actually already got a good amount of people on the stream. Cool, nice. We got someone from sunny UK. Very nice. Yeah, that is uncharacteristic. I'll actually be there in a few weeks here. Germany, awesome. Sweden, very cool. Excellent. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like we've got a good amount of people on the stream, and of course, anyone who might be joining late, you'll be able to see this in your feed for the next several days, or really kind of forever. You just go to the Gravitee LinkedIn page, go to the events. You can see all past live streams that we've run. But anyways, with that, I'll go ahead and get rolling. My name is Alex Drag. I'm joined by Michael Field. I'm one of our product evangelists. Michael is one of our solutions engineers. And we're here today to talk about self-service API platforms, or the what, why, and the how. And of course, it should go without saying, thank you all for joining. We're very excited to run through this with you all here, hear your thoughts, get your questions, see if we can answer them, so on and so forth. Before we really get into the presentation, we can hit the agenda and then just a few housekeeping items. So first, we'll actually start with a quick introduction to Gravitee. Recognize that not everybody on the stream is probably familiar with who we are and what we do. So we'll do a quick high-level intro. If you are new to API management generally, we won't be going into that as a concept as much today. If you are interested in learning more, though, we do have a live stream that we ran, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, on an introduction to event native API management. So you can go there. Once again, it's in the link. If you go to our LinkedIn page, go look at the events. You can see the past events, and you'll see the live stream recording there. So I'd highly recommend that. Then we'll jump into sort of what we mean when we say self-service API platforms, why we think they're important. And then Michael is going to actually build one for us in real time using the Gravitee platform. So make sure you stick around for that demo at the end, because it's super interesting. So housekeeping, make sure your audio is on. If you can't hear me, I've already confirmed that the audio is streaming to LinkedIn. So if you can't hear me, just make sure that your volume is turned up on your computer and that things aren't muted. If you have any questions, comments, etc., leave them in the comments, either on YouTube, we're streaming there, or on LinkedIn. We will answer them as they come through. Maybe not necessarily in real time, just we'll find places and times during the presentation where we think it makes sense. And of course, if we miss anything, we'll come back later. I'll be monitoring this for about a week or so on LinkedIn to see if there's any late questions that come through, and we'll get those things answered. Of course, if you don't feel comfortable asking in the comments, feel free just to reach out to me individually on LinkedIn, and I'll make sure to get an answer for you. And of course, please be respectful in the comments. We've not had an issue with this, but we always put that there just to be careful. All right, let's get into the actual meat. All right, so quick intro to Gravitee. Where are we focused? So I mentioned earlier, API management. That's what we are. We're a full lifecycle API management platform. There are several of those out there on the market. So I think it's worthwhile sort of digging into at least a little bit into where we focused, where we see ourselves is different from the rest. So that first category being full lifecycle API governance. So all the way from designing your APIs to exposing them via gateway, enforcing security, publishing them in a portal, debugging, monitoring, API observability, all sorts of stuff all those stages of the API lifecycle, we have solutions for, right? So we see ourselves as the most robust solution for managing your API across its entire lifecycle. The second one is event native. So once again, we have a presentation on the ins and outs of event native API management, but for sort of the quick and dirty, what you can usually do with an API management platform for your traditional synchronous REST API use case, you can do that with Gravitee. You can also do it when you are creating event API proxies for exposing event and message broker resources. We'll get into that a little more in a slide or two here, but just know full lifecycle API management. So basically, it's the depth of lifecycle management that we offer. Event native expands our breadth, right, to the amount of various backend resources that can be exposed via the Gravitee gateway and then managed as API proxies with the API management solution. And the third one is advanced security and identity and access management. So one of the interesting things about Gravitee is that we actually offer a fully featured identity and access management solution for things like MFA, biometrics, step-up authentication, authorization, et cetera, et cetera. But let's get going because I want to make sure we leave enough time for the demo at the end. I mentioned event native API management earlier. What does this mean, right? So we sort of have this platform architecture slide here that kind of gives a nice picture of it. So if you think about those various backend resources that you're traditionally exposing via something like an API gateway, an API management solution, your mind probably goes to REST, right? REST APIs. So you'd have a REST API. Instead of exposing that directly to your client side, you put a gateway in the middle, expose it as an API proxy via the API gateway, and then enforce security, monitoring practices, API design solutions, et cetera, once again, managing the entirety of the lifecycle of that REST API. You can do all of that with Gravitee, but you can also do that same set of things for your backend event and message brokers, right? So let's take Kafka Confluent. For example, one of the more common event and message brokers that we hear about, same thing with Solves, we hear about that a lot as well. So you can actually use Gravitee as an exposure and security layer for your event message brokers that you can then expose to your client side as event API proxies via the gateway. Now, the cool thing about Gravitee is that you can actually expose something like Kafka over non-Kafka protocols, right? Or a non-native Kafka protocol, rather. So you could expose Kafka as a REST API, as a WebSocket API, as a webhook subscription, or as a server-sent event API via the Gravitee gateway. And then you can enforce all the other API management stuff like authorization, traffic shaping. We can actually do some message transformation. And you start thinking about what we're going to get into today, actually publishing that API as an event API product in a developer portal so that your API consumers can easily find, discover, subscribe to your APIs in a self-service secure manner. But more on that later when we actually get into the self-service API platform portion of the presentation. What does this actually look like in practice? I like to refer to 4 simple steps, right? So step 1, you either bring your existing backend REST API, gRPC, SOAP web service, GraphQL API, or your HTTP API, you bring that, or you can use Gravity's API designer to at least design the data model and contract for that before implementation. But either way, you have this backend resource. Step 2 is use Gravitee to create that API proxy, not just for exposure, but also in tow with authorization, data filtering, monetization functionality, subscription and access creation and control. Step 3, you one-click publish it to an API catalog. So at step 4, your consumers can find and subscribe to these APIs as API products. So really simple 4 steps there. Once again, this is for that traditional REST API use case. We're talking event native. The cool thing about Gravitee is the same 4 steps, right? If you're wanting to expose event and message brokers as API or event message broker resources as API proxies to the client side, right? You still bring your event and message broker. Gravitee sits right on top where you can create that API proxy. In this instance, we're exposing a Kafka cluster instead of Kafka topics as an SSE API, WebSocket, and HTTP API for asynchronous and synchronous client-side consumption with authorization functionality, with some message filtering on top, monetization functionality, and once again, using Gravitee to create and control secure self-service subscriptions. Once again, we'll cover more of this in the demo. Step 3, you can push that just like that REST API proxy to the catalog. For step 4, consumer side subscription discovery, subscription, et cetera, et cetera. Cool. And I like to show this just because everyone asks. As far as how you can deploy Gravitee, it's always something that comes up, not necessarily super relevant for today's presentation, but I like to hit it just in case. So really, there's two options I want to cover here, that being hybrid and SaaS. So Gravitee offers a fully managed version of our solution, where we basically manage everything in our cloud environment. So you can offload all infrastructure management of the Gravitee solution to us, and then hybrid, where you can host some components and then we can host others, right? So it's a nice mix and match. Basically, it just depends on what you need. And then as far as how you can actually use and manage those Gravitee resources, we offer a GUI, a management API, and a Kubernetes operator for you Kube native teams out there, which enables you to manage Gravitee resources via the Kubernetes API in a declarative fashion using Gravity's CRDs. So with that, looks like we're about 11 minutes in. Perfect. So we're looking good on time. Let's get into what we mean by self-service API platforms. We've covered API management, but the self-service API platform is what you all are trying to build with an API management solution like Gravitee. What exactly does it look like? At the sort of high level, what you're trying to ensure is that your APIs are easily discoverable by the API consumers, whether those be internal or external consumers. They're easily then understood, so you can find them, you also understand them. This is the big thing that I think, I actually posted something on LinkedIn yesterday about how developer portals aren't developer portals aren't developer portals. What I mean by that is that developer portals really aren't created equally, right? If you can find an API, see its description, see its docs, that's really helpful. But if you can't easily, as the consumer or as the publisher, enable this functionality for that API to be subscribed to and then essentially then consumed, you're only getting halfway there, right? So this easy mode of subscription is huge. Mike's going to show that in the demo. So all this stuff needs to happen. Once again, easy discovery, easily understandable, easily subscribed to, and then easily consumed by that client-side application, all for the API consumer. Now, here's the other trick. All this has to be able to be done securely, reliably, and at high governance, right? As we all know on the live stream, yes, discoverability is great, but there are also APIs that you wouldn't want to be discoverable by everyone, and definitely not subscribed to and consumed by everyone, right? Because oftentimes we have APIs that are exposing access to things like PII and sensitive data. So that securely bit is really, really important there. So why does this matter? Well, and I think it's relatively straightforward. We like to cover it just in case. First, it speeds up development, right? So if you're some massive organization, the likelihood is that if you build an API to accomplish some tasks, that's probably reusable by someone else in your org. Also, well, we'll stick there actually before we go to the second one. So yes, you want to create that API as a reusable component. It's only really reusable though if it's easily found, right? So you want to be able to make that API discoverable to internal engineering teams or potentially external engineering teams like partners and maybe some customers. This allows you internally to speed up the actual delivery of your software, right? So if developer A builds API at some point that accomplishes task B, much better for that API to be then discovered by developer B so they can go ahead and use it instead of that developer B having to build their own, right? Sort of rebuild it, reinvent the wheel, right? So it helps you avoid sort of like redundant API creation. The second one is improving the developer experience. It's not just it's not just helping them avoid having to build something. It's also giving them a great experience as it pertains to helping them find exactly what they need when they need it in a self-service manner, right? So instead of him having to spend days, weeks, whatever, creating or looking for something, you give it to them immediately. The onboarding is awesome, and they can sort of get to their races doing what they're there to do, which is building really, really cool products. And then the third one here, driving revenue, not relevant to everyone, right? But we're seeing this more and more, this API monetization use case. Whether those APIs are being monetized directly, like you actually have a payment plan attached to consuming the API, or indirectly through things like partnerships and maybe some partners consuming your APIs so that they can sell things to their customers. But either way, both of these API monetization use cases ideally are going to be built on top of self-service API consumption models, right? Where you can publish an API to an API catalog or a developer portal so that your consumers, whether internal or external, in this case, likely paying external consumers, can find them, learn about them, decide if they want them, subscribe to them, and then boom, you are driving revenue for your organization. All right, we're about 15 minutes in, which is great. This is exactly where I wanted to end so that Mike would have plenty of time to demo. We've talked about what self-service API platforms are, why they matter. But now we actually want to show you how to build one. So Mike is going to run us through the Gravitee product and actually build a self-service API offering from scratch. So Mike, I'll go ahead and remove myself from the stage and let you get moving on the demo.
Sweet. Appreciate the introduction, Alex. So let me pull up my screen now. All right, let me know when you can see this portal screen.
Yep, we're all good.
Perfect. All right, so I'm going to run through a few things. Obviously, this is going to be very focused on the developer portal, and we're going to start with a basic REST API use case. But then we're also going to show how you can create some of the asynchronous or event-driven APIs that Alex referred to as well, and then publish that API to the portal from scratch. But to start with this demo, let's do a walkthrough of the actual developer portal. So the screen you see here is what the portal is going to look like by default. So if you spun up Gravitee right now, if you're running it locally or you started a brand new trial, it's going to look very similar to this. But everything you see on this page can be customized. Fonts, logos, colors, spacing, different text here, the home page, all that is customizable. So a lot of times developer portals, these are API catalogs for external consumers, and you want your branding to be very on point. So Gravitee has a built-in theme editor to support that. Now, obviously, this is the home page here, and the main thing right here is to come and discover different APIs. So there's a lot of ways you can organize your APIs. You're going to see a list of APIs that are made available to you. You can also categorize these APIs. A lot of times people will do this by product categories. Each page can also have its own documentation here and see the list of APIs. Another really powerful part of the portal is we support full context search. And so what this means is it's not just searching for the title here, but any documentation you have uploaded alongside your API, including the actual spec itself, is searchable through here. So I know one of these APIs talks about debugging. So let's go ahead and open up that API. So you see here, we have this HTTP bin API. This is a common public API people use just to work on different kind of standard REST use cases. And so we have a documentation page here for the home page that kind of covers this API at a high level, lets the consumer know what they're looking at, broadly describes the different features through the different endpoints that are made available, and talks about things like the response format. And then I added some own documentation about the plans piece. So plans are basically a contract. They're saying there are different ways to request access to an API, and they're also where security is handled. So I, as an API consumer, if I want to access the API, it's always through one of the available plans. And so you can see these are also detailed here in the documentation. And one of these plans is a keyless plan, which is essentially going to provide public access to this API. And as it says here, there's no authorization token required. But it does make the note, this access is going to be limited to read only, basically saying only the get method is going to work and everything else will be blocked. If I want additional access, that's going to be made through the API key plan, but that is something I have to subscribe to through the developer portal, which is where we are now, and that subscription will automatically be validated. So let's take a closer look at some further documentation before we move forward with the plans. And so what we've included here is basically the Open API specification, where I can come in here, I can see all the different endpoints available. And the cool thing here is built into the portal. This can be disabled if you want, but I have it enabled on this particular API, is Swagger's Try It Out mode. And this essentially allows you to have a API client built into your developer portal for your consumers as they come and view different APIs. So let's go ahead and test this out. This is the get method. I'm not providing any form of authorization, but this should be open through the keyless plan. And we can see the request that's sent. I can actually see the request is being pushed to the actual gateway where this API is hosted. And we can see we get a 200 back with the response body, which again is pretty cool just for testing out these different endpoints. Now, if I try to send maybe a different method, you can see here, this is a post method made very clear by actually being a post route. If I try to send a request through here, we're actually going to get a 405 and a response back that's saying this method is not allowed while accessing this resource, which is exactly what we'd expect because, again, we pass no form of authorization, and this is blocked for subscribers of the keyless plan. So now showing if I want to request access to this API, how easy this actually is, and built into the portal itself. All I need to do is come up here and click on subscribe. the first thing it's going to show me is all the plans available to me as a consumer. Now, depending on who you're logged in as, I'm logged in as myself, obviously, you can make different plans available to different consumers. So perhaps this keyless plan is only available to internal developers, and the API key plan is available to all developers. I'll show that a bit more when we actually pull up the console UI, which is where you handle the configuration for your APIs, but just wanted to call that out as well. Of course, the keyless plan is what we were just using through the API client, which is saying, hey, this API is available to start using now. But we want more than just read access. We want to be able to hit the post endpoint. So let's go through this API key plan. Now, the only thing I need to provide as a consumer is which application am I requesting access for. So let's go ahead and use this demo app. So I have two choices. This is made available. If I want to use one API key through multiple APIs, I can do that for this application. But I'm going to go ahead and have it generate a new API key. The last thing is it's going to have me agree to any general terms and conditions of use. This is especially important for any kind of monetization flows, as Gravitee will audit this and track and ensure that they actually accepted these terms. Then we'll go ahead and send through that request. And since this was set to auto-validate subscriptions, which is just a quicker form of nobody actually had to approve this, I now have immediate access. You can see here it's actually put a request together for us. I'm going to go ahead and modify it a little bit. So I'm going to make my own request. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the terminal. You could use any API client here, whatever you're comfortable with, something like a Postman. And so if I go back, the context path was just dev portal. So go ahead and do dev portal. Now we're going to send something to the post endpoint. I'm going to send a payload in here, and we're going to include the API key that was just generated. And so that x-gravity-api-key is the default header that Gravitee is looking for, but you can change that to whatever you want it to be. So let's go ahead and send this request through. And we see now we get a 200 back instead of the previous 405 that blocked us. And so everything is working as expected, and I'm now an active consumer through the API key plan. And it was as easy as that from the consumer perspective. So next, I want to take a little bit of a step back, kind of show how we got to this point by actually building out one of these APIs, showing some of the policies in place that actually made this possible to block requests for certain subscribers and not subscribers of other plans, and then also how we actually uploaded things like the documentation piece. So before I move on to that, just want to do a quick pause, check in with Alex, see if we've had any questions come through so far.
Nope, so far we're all good, Mike. I'll let you know if anything comes up.
Perfect. Okay, so again, this is the developer portal UI. This is one of the main components, UI components in the overall platform of Gravity's API management solution. But there's another also extremely core piece, which is our console UI. So again, the developer portal UI, this is all about consuming and discovering APIs, but to actually manage those APIs and create new APIs, that's done inside the management console UI, which is what we're looking at here. Now, there's a lot of different aspects here, but today we're trying to focus on actually building a new API and adding those things I mentioned previously, which are plans, policies, and documentation, and then showing how to upload that to the developer portal. So you can see here a list of APIs that I've already created, but we're going to go ahead and make a brand new API. So Gravitee provides another number of options for actually creating these APIs. We have a wizard to help you create them from scratch. We also have an API designer that actually allows you to build the backend API from scratch and actually build out using a mind map and generate an open API specification for you. And then, of course, we support importing a number of different API specifications. So certainly, if you already have your own backend APIs and you already have your own open API specs, you can import those straight into Gravitee and start working with them immediately. But just to show the wizard, we're actually going to create an API from scratch here. So we're going to create an API here with the Masters coming up here in a few weeks. We're going to have this one focused on Tiger Woods, who is without a doubt the greatest golfer of all time. So that's what we're going to have our details be about. Details about the greatest golfer of all time. All right, so we're going to go ahead and flesh this API out just a little bit. So the first big decision when you make an API in Gravitee is which type of API are you creating? So the first option, proxy upstream protocol, this is kind of the standard you get with most API management solutions. This is the API we were just looking at, where basically your upstream or your backend API or service is going to be exposed through Gravitee using the same protocol. So for example, if you have a REST API on your backend, it's going to be exposed through REST on the front end, or HTTP as the protocol. Same thing with WebSocket. It's just going to pass through that protocol. So again, we support this. This is Gravity's bread and butter. But one thing we do that is totally different from the competition here is what we call protocol mediation, which is the second option. And what this does is it allows you to expose event or message brokers on the back end. So something like a Kafka or an MQTT server can then be exposed to API consumers through web-friendly protocols, like something like a WebSocket, something like HTTP, and maybe a webhook or SSC. So we're going to focus on this one since we already showed a REST API in the portal. So we're going to go ahead and select our API architecture. Now, the first decision we need to make is, how do we want to expose this API to consumers? These are the API entry points. And we can select any combination of these. So we can expose it through all these different protocols. We can select one. So for this example, we're going to work with WebSockets, because WebSockets is pretty cool in the sense that it's a bidirectional protocol. So you can actually both publish and subscribe to the event or message broker on the back end through a single connection. So we'll go ahead and select WebSocket. Now, the next thing we need to provide is a context path. Context paths are something kind of unique to the gateway itself. This is not being forwarded to your backend service. It's essentially how the gateway handles routing. So every time you create an API in Gravitee or you upload one from an existing spec, it needs to include a unique context path. So when a request comes into the gateway might have 15 different APIs running on it. It needs to know which API is it trying to route to. So that's where the context path comes into play. So we'll go ahead and call this context path Tiger here. And then the only other configuration on the entry point is specific to the entry points you select. So for WebSocket, the main choice is, do we want to allow people to publish and subscribe? So let's actually just allow people to subscribe through this entry point. And you can define things like quality and service, but this applies more to things like service and events entry points. So let's go ahead and validate this. Now, the next step is choosing the backend service that we actually want to proxy with the API gateway. So just real quick, if I wanted to go with something like Kafka, I'll show what that looks like. We're eventually going to get a bunch of different configuration options specific to this particular message broker. So, setting up, if you're familiar with Kafka, you have to provide bootstrap servers. You can allow people to consume or produce or both. You got to select your security configuration. We're going to support all the major Kafka security configs, so SASL, SSL, and then what kind of mechanism you want to use, and then providing that to your Jazz config. You can set up SSL. You can provide the different topics, and you can do things like auto offset reset. Can all be configured here. But again, I don't have a Kafka cluster up and running, so we're going to keep it quite simple here. And we're actually going to use the mock backend service, which is something that's great for testing and great for demos like this. So we're going to use our mock server here. We're going to go ahead and validate. Now, the mock server is basically just going to generate messages as soon as a consumer connects through one of the entry points. So we're going to make this produce a message every 500 milliseconds or half second when somebody connects. And we're going to say, for Tiger here, we're going to say big cat on the prowl, as he will be playing in the Masters in 2 weeks, and he will be competing and hopefully winning the Masters there. So we're going to have that set up to let people know when they connect to this API. And we're going to leave everything else here as default. So we're going to go ahead and validate these endpoints. Now, the fourth and final step here is creating plans. So you can see here, by default, we have a keyless plan included. And we're going to go ahead and add one additional plan here. Now, there's a number of different security types that you can add. We support things like OAuth and JOT. The difference here being OAuth does full token introspection. JOT is just going to validate the actual signature on the bearer token that you pass. Of course, keyless is the public access. These two options require integrating with some kind of authorization server. So we're going to keep things simple and just add an API key plan. And so we'll go ahead and call it API key plan. Keep things simple as far as the naming goes. On the previous one, we auto-validated the subscription, but this time we're going to do a manual approval so we can show that. This is the access control I mentioned, where I can exclude certain groups from even being able to see this plan, but we're going to leave that as default. If you have a backend service that is also validating the key, you can propagate that API key to the upstream server, but we don't need to do that certainly not for a mock broker. So leave that as default. And then these are basically quick ways to add different policies here, but we're going to do this separately inside of the policy studio. So we're going to go ahead and add this plan. You can see both of our plans there. Let's go ahead and validate. And we're going to get a final kind of review screen of our Tiger Woods API here. And we can see our mock broker with our WebSocket entry point and our 2 plans. And everything looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and save and deploy this API to the gateway. All right, so we've now received confirmation that our API has been created. So let's go ahead and open up this API and get a few more details. So you can see this inner sidebar is opened up. We can see the API, the Tiger Woods API that we now have open, and we can see a number of different options for actually configuring this API. So also, again, we have our 2 plans already up and running, which is great. That's exactly what we'd want to see, as that's what we created inside of the wizard. And so from here, we're going to go ahead and do 2 additional things. We're going to focus a little bit on the policy studio and show again how we do certain things like resource filtering and how we can actually modify the messages coming through from the backend broker. And we're also going to show how you can add some documentation so your consumers can actually understand what's going on with this API before they actually try to request access. All right, so let's go ahead and open up the policy studio. So if you haven't used Gravitee before, or really any kind of one of the major API management solutions, policies are kind of the bread and butter of an API management solution. These are the executable bits of logic that can run during an API transaction. So again, during a traditional synchronous API, during the request and response, these are different policies you can run. Things like rate limiting, you can do different data filtering and shaping. You can do JSON validation. You can transform JSON to XML, all sorts of different policies like that. And again, that's where a lot of the power of the gateway comes from, is these policies that can run. And something totally unique about Gravitee is for these asynchronous APIs, or when you're working with an event or a message broker, is Gravitee can actually apply policies down to the individual message level. So Gravitee can actually transform each of the messages that are coming through and modifying that actual payload. And so the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to actually simulate the mock broker kind of acting more like a Kafka broker on the back end. So we're going to create a new flow. Now, flow is nothing more than a collection of policies, as you'll see here in just a minute. And so we're going to use Kafka lingo here and talk in the form of topics. So we're going to create a majors topic. The channel here, we're going to have it be just /majors. And we're going to make this, well, so there's only one entry point. We'll just leave that as default. And we're going to go ahead and create this flow. So we can see here, a new flow has been created under common flows. Common flows, meaning flows that are set up here, will apply to all API consumers. But as we'll see in a bit, you can also create flows that are specific to particular plans. So now that we have this flow opened up, we can see over here under flow details as to where we actually add policies. So policies can be added in 2 different places. There's the initial connection, which is made up of 2 different phases, the request phase and the response phase. And so the initial connection, just like it sounds, is just when that connection is being established. So in the case of the WebSocket connection, it will only apply when the consumer first starts that connection. But in this case, we actually want to modify every message that's coming through. So we need a policy that runs every time a message is either published or produced from the actual broker on the back end. So what we're going to do is, again, we're trying to simulate a Kafka topic here, so a majors topic. So when they connect to this topic, we actually want to send back different data that was sent to this particular topic. So we're going to open up the policies here that are available. We're going to see a list here, and we're going to use this assign content policy. Now what this does is it's going to transform the content of the body or the message that comes through. And so what we want to do is override what we set that mock broker to produce on the back end and make this specific about major. And so we're going to say Tiger currently has 15 majors, but after the 24 masters, he will have 16 majors under his belt. And we're going to go ahead and add that policy in here now. So we can see that policy has been added to the subscribe phase. And again, this is a flow, so I could add as many policies here as I want to run, but we're going to keep this flow pretty basic and just have one policy here. So we're going to go ahead and save that change. You'll see this banner pop up, and we'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to add an additional policy here. So this is, again, going to happen for anybody who calls this majors topic, but I only want people to have access to this topic who have actually subscribed through the API key plan. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a flow for users of the keyless plan, and we're going to call this, we'll just say resource filtering, because that's what we're going to end up doing. And we're going to apply this to that same channel. So anybody from the keyless plan who calls that majors topic, I'm going to go ahead and create that. And we see it's been created up here. And so this time we're actually going to apply it on the initial connection and basically stop these messages from coming through. So during the request phase here, now I'm going to search for that resource filtering policy. I'm going to go ahead and grab that. And you can see here, I can both either whitelist or blacklist things. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm basically just going to block all access. And so we're just going to do, you can see here it supports ant style path patterns, and say basically, at least for this particular path, everything is going to be blocked. So I'm going to go ahead and add that policy, and we're going to go ahead and save that change as well. So one thing to call out here now is you can see we got that toast notification on the bottom. Everything's been confirmed. These changes have been saved. If I were to leave and come back, close this tab, nothing will change here. This is all saved and now part of this API, but nothing's actually changed from the perspective of the gateway. So for this to actually work with the gateway, I need to deploy this API. And so deploy acts like a sync mechanism, and saying, hey, basically push these changes that we just made to the API running on the gateway. So let's go ahead and deploy our changes. And we can see that things have been successfully deployed with our 2 new policies. And so everything is exactly as we would expect. Now, so the API is prepped, but for consumers to know how this actually operates, of course, we need to provide some documentation. So let's go over to our documentation page.
Mike, we actually have a question on policies just really quickly. So someone's asking if they can manage flows as code. So specifically asking about if you can store flow definitions as code in a version control and use Gravity's API to apply the code. So I know the answer is yes. Can you just walk through that in a bit more detail, how that would work?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, like you said, the answer is absolutely. And so, of course, you can use things to configure in the API, but, in the UI, but underneath the hood, all that's happening is Gravitee is building out our own API definition. And so at any time, you can actually export this API. I'm not sure if everyone can see this, but it just basically pushed out a JSON file here that has all my configuration here. So again, any documentation, plans I add, and of course, things like the policy. And so what a lot of people will do is they'll initially create this API just using our UI like I am today. Once they're kind of happy with the basic setup, they'll export that JSON API definition like I just did, and then they'll store that in some kind of version control. And so then any future changes that want to be made, are carefully monitored and again, version controlled. And then you can actually push those changes directly to the gateway through our management API. So if you're going kind of for a full infrastructure as code flow, you actually don't need to use the UI at all. But again, this is kind of a great way to learn about the product.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. And then there was one more question. It's how are we different to Kong API Gateway? So let me reach out to you individually. There are some stark differences between us and Kong and other API Gateway solutions out there. And I'm more than happy to have that conversation. But in public live streams, I try to be as respectful as possible to all our competitors and other solutions in the market. So let's have that. We'll have that conversation one-to-one. Once again, I'll reach out to you in just a few minutes. And then one more, any feature which uses Gen AI. Yeah, we actually have some interesting spec generation stuff that we could chat about. We won't be showing it today, but if you are interested, I'll reach out to you directly as well, and we can have that conversation.
Okay.
Cool. I think, Mike, that's all we had questions wise. You can get going. I'll let you know if anything else comes through.
Cool. All right. So again, the next step is now we're going to actually create some documentation. So There's a number of different things you can do for your documentation. As I showed on that first API, of course, you can upload any specifications you have. In the case of an API like this, it would probably be an async API spec instead of an open API spec. And we fully support that. But just for this quick example, obviously, I'm just using a mock API here. Would it really map that well to an actual specification? I'm just going to create a handwritten documentation page. And again, we'll call this Tiger Woods docs. We'll make this public to everybody. Just like you can do with your plans, you can also have access control on the actual documentation level. So you can have some docs that, again, could be for a certain group of consumers and restricted from other people if that's something you want to do. But we're going to make this fully public. And then we have a built-in markdown editor here. So what we're going to do is, this is the Tiger Woods API. So we're going to give it a quick title. This API is all about Tiger is the GOAT. Start sending requests to learn more. And then we're going to have, we'll call out our different topics here. And so our first topic that we have is what we did for the majors. So let's do this majors topic. This topic, we're going to provide more info about Tiger's performance in the majors. However, it is only available to subscribers of the API key plan. All right. So obviously some very basic documentation here, but will be good enough for this example. And if everything looks good, I can go ahead and save and publish this page, which we're going to do. And we can see the status here. It's now been published with public visibility. Again, I can add as many pages if I want. I can also create folders and organize this however I want. But everything's looking good. Now, before I publish this API and we hop back into the developer portal, one other thing to call out. So I've shown how, again, you can obscure certain documentation pages. Same thing on plans. There's that kind of a group access control where I can say, okay, I only want certain users to have access to this particular plan. So again, those are kind of more granular options, but it's also important to call out that we can also do this on an actual API level. So by default, the only member of the API is the actual creator of the API, which in this case, of course, is myself. But I can add different members in here, and I can also set their roles. And there's a number of pre-built roles in Gravitee, but you can also create your own custom roles. And roles are basically just a collection of permissions. So, I could add members here with basic user permissions. Maybe they can see and subscribe to the API, but they can't actually edit anything inside the console. So there's all sorts of different things you can do there. You can also add entire groups. So if you have a group of developers, you could add them here instead of adding individual members one by one. But again, since I'm logged in by myself, I'm, of course, already going to have access to this API, but I did want to call that out. Okay, so with everything looking good, the last step here is we're going to go back to our general info page. Now, when I created this API, I saved it and I deployed it to the gateway. So it's already live on the gateway. And so that's why the option here is to stop the API. Each of these options here are basically toggles. So it's already running on the gateway, but nobody's going to know that unless I actually publish this API to the portal. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. And so now it's published, so I'll be able to find it. But I do want to call out, there's also an option here to make an API public. If you make it public, as it says here, everyone can see it. So essentially, it's going to somewhat ignore what you have for user and group access from the perspective of the portal. It's just saying anybody who has access to the portal UI will at least be able to see this particular API. So I want to call that out as well. All right, everything's looking good. So now we're going to return to this page. And we're going to go back to our main catalog. And we're going to go see a list of our APIs. And we can see here, we have our new Tiger Woods API focused around the greatest golfer of all time. I didn't provide a homepage, so it basically describes the description for the homepage, but I will be able to see the custom documentation we uploaded. So the basic information and saying, hey, there's a majors topic exposed through our, in this case, simulated Kafka broker running on the back end that we can get more information from. But before I go any further, I do want to show actually how we create those applications, because that's something I kind of brushed over in the first step, and I just use an existing application. So let's do that, and then we'll actually return to this API. So click on applications. I can see any applications that I previously created. So we can see here, we have 3 currently, but let's go ahead and create a new application. So again, an application is basically, it's another layer of abstraction from the consumer perspective. It's a very important one for a number of different reasons. Certainly, if you're doing something like an OAuth flow, there's client IDs assigned to these applications, which is a very important part of those OAuth flows, and it's how you would actually request something like an access token. It's also important for just realistic workflows. If you have 20 developers working on a particular API, you don't want each developer coming and requesting access for that API. You want just the actual application. So somebody will create this application and then add their team members to that particular application. And then the publisher is not managing access to individual users. They're just managing access for that particular application. So let's go ahead and create one. We'll be a Tiger Woods fan in this case. Be the world's biggest fan. You can provide a domain here. If this is something like a web application, which is important for things like cores, but we're just going to make this a very simple machine-to-machine, or actually we'll do a simple application. So these options here, these require something called dynamic client registration, which essentially means it is going to offload the creation of that application to some kind of identity provider that will both generate the client ID and the client secret for that application. So that's something that needs to be set up separately. But for simple use cases like this, we provide this simple application type. You can certainly disable something like this in production. But what this allows us to do is basically provide our client ID manually. And so we'll just go ahead and do that here. We'll just call it the Tiger Woods ID. And we'll keep moving. We're going to do the subscription separately. And then we'll get a kind of a review of our application. And we'll go ahead and create that app. So now I can open it up. And we'll get all sorts of details here. And again, certainly if you're using something like DCR or dynamic client registration, you'd be able to see not just your client ID, but also your client secret. So you can request things like access token. You can provide different metadata. You can see all your active subscriptions. Like I mentioned previously, you can add different team members here. So again, one person can basically request access for this application, and then all team members will have access to kind of any credentials that are generated. Again, you can have different roles here and permissions for users that you add. And you can also do things like analytics and logs and setting up different notifications and alerts. And by default, everybody basically who is added as a user will receive these different notifications. So with that set up, let's go ahead and return one more time to the API that we just created. So we'll go ahead and open up this Tiger Woods API. And we've already reviewed the documentation. So let's go ahead and subscribe now. And just like before, we're going to see our 2 different plans available. So we should be able to access now through our keyless plan. So let's actually just open up the terminal real quick. Now this time we want to access the API through the WebSocket protocol instead of HTTP. It's going to be the same domain of the gateway. So again, this is exactly the same gateway we were sending it to before, but we're using a different protocol here. We're using WebSockets. So now we actually set this up to run through the Tiger context path. So let's send that through, and it's working as expected. We're getting our big cat on the prowl message. But now let's try to send a request through to that majors topic. So we're going to split in a different endpoint here. And if I configured everything correctly, it should just hang. So that's our resource filtering policy kicking in. Because I'm just a keyless subscriber here, I don't actually have access to this majors topic. I'm being blocked by the gateway. So to get through to this, what we're going to need to do is just like before, we're going to need to subscribe. So let's jump back over here to the portal. Let's subscribe to the API key plan. Let's select our brand new application. And let's go ahead and send in this request. Now this time we didn't select auto validation, so we don't receive any confirmation here. So one more time, jumping in as the form of an API publisher. You'll see here, I'm actually going to get a notification with a task here, but I'm just going to jump straight to where subscriptions live, which is right here. And we see that's come through. So we can see the status is pending. I can review it, see the user who actually sent the request. I can see the application type, details on that application, and see that it's a simple application type. Everything looks good. I can go ahead and validate it. I'm going to leave everything as default here, which basically gives them indefinite access. I'm not putting an expiration date, and I'm just going to let Gravitee generate an API key for them. And we can see it's been validated. The key's been generated. At any point, I can revoke or set an expiration date. I can rotate this key, and I can actually pause the subscription or close it down completely. But now, from the consumer perspective, I'll also receive a notification. I can go to my application, and now on my subscription page, what I'm going to see here is this has been accepted. I can see the API key has been generated here. So if I return to the terminal one more time, we're going to send a very similar request, but this time we're going to pass an API key. And so this is a WebSocket connection. So we're going to do it with a query parameter. We're going to use that API key query parameter, and we're going to try sending this through. And we can see now we're able to hit that majors topic without issue, and talking about how Tiger will be winning a major again in 2 weeks, which is quite exciting. So this is a pretty powerful API predicting the future. And that kind of wraps up at least the key cases I want to walk through for the demo today. So I'll go ahead and pause there again and check in with Alex, see if we have any new questions.
Awesome. Yeah, we do have several questions, but just for anyone who may have joined a few minutes late, I just want to quickly recap everything that we showed. So in about the span of 30 minutes, Mike went from a place of having no API created to creating an API with Gravitee, enforcing subscription controls via Gravitee plans, enforcing additional policies and logic via the gateway, pushing that API then to an API catalog with documentation for self-service access for API consumers. So pretty impressive stuff to accomplish within 30 minutes, just for anyone who may have missed it. Feel free to rewind, watch this over again, or if you have any questions about anything, feel free to reach out to us individually. That said, we do have, I see 3 new questions, and then once we get through these, I'll refresh to see if there are any more. Once again, if you do have any questions, just put them in the YouTube or the LinkedIn comments, and we'll make sure that we get to them. One, this is actually kind of it's really, I guess it's one question, 2 parts. So the first part, Mike, is can I use validate requests in V2 like an OAS validation policy? The second one is, can you explain how to reject all requests that don't match any flow conditions? So both policy related queries.
Yeah, so if you want it to validate based on your spec, there's a couple of different things you can do. So yes, you could do that. You can use the resource filtering policy, but that's kind of a lot of manual work, right? Basically, I would have to add in all the paths that currently exist. So each endpoint I would have to add in here and whitelist those. So that's a lot of work. But what you can do, this is not a REST API, so let me switch to a REST API real quick. Let's see if I have a v4 proxy. And I go here. And what you can do is, if I open up the settings here, is I can do fail on flow mismatch. And so when you actually upload an API spec to Gravitee, there will be an option to create a flow for each endpoint automatically. And so what you can do is, instead of having to create a policy for that, you can just turn on this setting and basically says, if a flow is not explicitly defined, it's going to fail for all users. And it's basically saying, okay, it's going to check for each request. Does that endpoint match a flow that I have defined? If it doesn't, we can go ahead and reject that request. So that's probably, I would say, the easiest way to do it if you want to tie it basically to a specific open API spec. And then for the second part of the question, if we hop back here, go to our Tiger Woods API. If you just want to block, basically, was that the question, Alex, to block all access essentially?
Yeah, to reject all requests that don't match any flow conditions.
Okay, well, that's what I just showed then. If you want to reject all requests, you can do exactly what I did with this blacklist and just kind of use whatever path pattern you want to block. This is kind of like a catch-all to block all requests coming through for subscribers of this particular plan.
Cool. The other question that came through is about system integrators and implementation partners. So I will reach out to you individually, and we can make sure we get you connected with somebody. Then the next one that just came through is this recorded? Yeah, so all the LinkedIn live streams you can go watch from the very beginning. If you just go to our LinkedIn page and look at the events, you should be able to find all the stuff that we've done of late, including this one, once this is done. I'll go ahead and reach out to you individually just in case, though, just to make sure that you have no problems finding that recording. Let's see. If anybody else has any questions, please do put them in the comments. But for now, I think we're good. Let me refresh.
my screen, see if anything else has come through. Okay, I think that's about it, and we're right near time. We're about 6 minutes early, so that's great. Once again, if you're watching this after we technically shut the live stream off, I'll be monitoring questions and we'll come back to you, no problem. But before we wrap up, I did just want to cover some good next steps. So I'll be putting some links to these resources in the comments here in just a second. If you all are interested in putting in place some of the stuff that Michael showed during the demo today, the best next step really is booking some time to chat with someone like Michael, right? We're offering free consultations with the solutions engineering team, specifically around building self-service API platforms. So I'll put a link to booking some time with someone like Mike in the LinkedIn comments. And then the second is to, if you're not ready to do that, but you want to learn a bit more, we do have a self-service API platform white paper that's totally free. Covers some cool industry research that sort of dives into what's going on in the world of developer portals today and how, once again, you can get started using API management and Gravitee specifically. So once again, I'll put some links in the comments to that in just a few minutes. And actually, while I was covering this, looks like we have one more question that did come through. Do you have a sample GitHub repo for managing config and code as pipelines? Does Gravitee provide pipelines, GitHub Actions, etc. for validation and apply? And is YAML also supported apart from JSON for managing code? So a long question, Mike, but hopefully you can break that down.
Yeah, so for the first part, we don't have like an example repo built out, but as Alex mentioned, kind of you meet with one of our solutions engineer, and certainly if you kind of move forward towards like what we call a POC stage, that's something that we can help you actually build out based on your different needs. I'm sure we have some basic example configurations that we could share with you guys because we do this all the time for things like creating APIs and updating policies. But to my knowledge, there's no just kind of public sample repo that you can go explore now. And that's actually a good question on the YAML. I think we should double back and actually verify. I know we only export in JSON, so I'm assuming you can also only import in JSON. But that's something I do want to verify because we might actually support importing a YAML spec. Actually, I think I can validate that right now. I believe you actually can do YAML imports. Let's just see real quick. Yeah, we support YAML imports. So what you could do if you wanted is you could export the API definition as JSON, use any kind of available JSON to YAML converter. That's super easy to do. Just throw it to ChatGPT, it'll do it for you. And then you can kind of manage that as a YAML file and of course then upload it back to Gravitee using the YAML spec.
Awesome. Okay. That looks like it's all the questions that we have for now. Once again, we're right near the top of the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Once again, thank you to everyone who took the time. We had a bunch of people stay on this live stream, at least about 150 throughout the entire time, a little more at certain moments. That's really exciting. We really appreciate your time. We will make sure to follow up with everyone who had questions, make sure your question was answered. And once again, if there's anything that you were interested in today, highly recommend booking some time with Mike or checking out that white paper. Once again, links to those resources will be in the comments. So until our next live stream, which should happen in about 2 weeks, we'll go ahead and say adios. And once again, thanks again, and we'll see you all soon. Bye, everybody.